Hi friends, long time no listen, am I right? The team has been very busy with some personal projects. This means you'll be stuck with little old me for the next little while. I'll share more details about some upcoming projects and exciting updates in the next episode, but that's the future. Let's focus on the now. Have you ever wondered about the difference between hospice and palliative care? Well, even if you haven't, we've just got the episode for you. I had the pleasure of speaking with Katrielle, the Senior Communications Officer at the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association. That's also known as CHPCA. Katrielle and I first connected back in 2021 when Philotimo Life was just a budding idea, and over the years, we've had some incredible conversations. I'm thrilled to have her on the podcast to dive into this important topic. Let's jump in. Kat, my dear friend, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be chatting with you. So to get us started, if you can, please share just a little bit about your background and how you got involved in hospice and palliative care.
All right. Yeah. So I'm Katrielle. Most people call me Kat, though. The only time I hear my full name is usually when I'm in trouble. And I'm the Senior Communications Officer at the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association. I use she, her pronouns just as a sharing for everyone, but also I kind of came into this not from the hospice palliative care space. Actually, I come at it from the communications world in nonprofits. But I was lucky enough to kind of grow up in a home where illness, dying, death were things that were normally talked about. Come from a very large French Canadian family, and so lots of people means more people getting sick, more people dying. My dad was a caregiver for his mom with lupus in the 70s when he was 9, through his early 20s, and so talking about what happens when a child, what would happen to you if mom and dad got sick or something happened and you couldn't be at home, where would you go? Those were things that, were really scary for my dad growing up. So he wanted to make sure that those were conversations we had with me. And also just because of the sheer quantity of people in my family, there was a lot of people who died. And so, by the age of 5, I literally don't know how many funerals I'd been to at that point. And so grief and death were things that were just normal, that I viewed myself as being kind of old hat at, as strange as that sounds. But, and then my relationship with grief also really significantly changed in my mid-20s. When my friend Zach passed away, really suddenly, unexpectedly, we had gone for drinks a few weeks prior. And then all of a sudden that hits me. At the same time, it was right around the holidays. I was doing finals for grad school. I was moving, I was switching jobs, and then that happened. And it really shook me because it was so unexpected. He was my age-ish, and we'd known each other since high school. And then a year after that, my grandfather passed away. That was a long time coming. He was not great at taking care of himself, and he had significant health issues. So we all kind of knew it was happening. And then a year later, I was at a friend's house, and I told this funny story from high school that involved Zach. And afterwards, I went and had myself a good old-fashioned mental breakdown in the bathroom.
As one does, time to time.
That's no problems. This is fine. Grief is fun sometimes that way, but it hit me at that moment where I was like, oh, I can talk about my grandpa who died a year ago and be okay.
Mm-hmm.
If I mention a funny story that Zach is tangentially involved in, I'd fall apart. And he died a year prior to that. And I mean, Zach was a good friend, but we weren't like best friends. He was the kind of friend, you get together with and you don't, maybe you haven't spoken in like 6 months, but you can just like pick up where you left off and just chit chat, and it's the good old times again. So, we weren't the closest friends, but we kept in touch. We stayed up to, I sent him cat pictures on Snapchat, and we would just go back and forth with the cat pictures. And I was in therapy for other things, and I kind of mentioned this, and it was when my therapist kind of mentioned like, well, it seems like you really haven't grieved, Zach. And I was like, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I know this grief thing. I've done it like so many times. I know what to do. But at the same time, I was going like, well, I did all of my normal grief things. I did all of the things that I normally do. And it's clearly not working. What's going on? And that's when I discovered the wonderful world of anticipatory grief and realizing, oh, I front load my grief before the person's dying. And that was when I discovered that because Zach's death was so sudden and unexpected, I hadn't actually fully grieved him because I didn't get the chance to grieve him while he was still alive. And that really changed the whole way that I look at grief, and realizing that we don't, even though I thought I understood grief so well, it was a new experience because it was something I hadn't lived through before. But then also I didn't realize that anticipatory grief or pre-grieving was a thing. And so when the opportunity to come join the CHPCA a few years after that kind of came up, I was like, some people might be intimidated by working in the hospice palliative care space. But I'm also just kind of, as a person, morbidly inclined. I don't know if that's correlated to anything else.
You're in great company. Don't worry.
I know. I'm in the right place. But yeah, and that's when, and as I learned more about hospice palliative care and grief, I realized how much of this was actually really relevant to my life, and I actually had a lot more experience with it than I thought I did. And all that to say, a very long-winded way to say of, I had been through several grief experiences in my life. I'd been through several losses of people after long illnesses, unexpected deaths. And so I thought I knew this space. And then I joined CHPCA, and I realized how much I also didn't know. And so it's been really a wonderful learning experience, and also really invigorating and life affirming to see all the amazing work that's happening out there in the communities. And really, as the senior comms officer there, I relish my job of celebrating and uplifting and sharing the wonderful message and the amazing things that are happening in communities across Canada in my role.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the anticipatory element. Listeners, I think we have an episode on that, so you better know what that is. But so many people are just so unaware of the different types of grief, how it shows up. And like even yourself, you were mentioning how you experienced grief at such a young age. And even yourself, when it happened, you were like, what's going on? What's happening? So in this podcast, we actually have an episode that breaks down the differences between palliative and hospice care. And I know people often group those two together and they think that they're the same thing. What have been some common misconceptions that you've needed to either debunk or fact check during this time in this industry that you've been working in? And if you're okay answering, what's been the most frustrating one?
I want to say, there's so many things. Palliative care in so many ways is really fundamentally misunderstood, even within the medical circle, within the medical world, within the healthcare world. So many people really have a deep misunderstanding of what this is all about. And I think that that's been somewhat part of the most frustrating thing has been encountering people who have been, healthcare providers, physicians for 30 plus years who say, oh no, we're not at palliative we're not at palliative yet. We're not there yet. There's still things to try. I haven't given up yet. As if somehow palliative care is giving up. And I think that that's been the most frustrating thing is encountering people who view palliative care as the last resort. Oh, there's nothing else I can do. Let me shuffle them off to someone who can help them die with, pain control, so on and so forth. And I think that's been somewhat frustrating because we really are, and it's not frustration at those healthcare providers. It's frustrations at the system who isn't preparing them for what palliative care can do and telling them this is the gift you can give patients and families. And I think that that's been part of the most frustrating thing. And also kind of the perception especially among the healthcare leaders or politicians and decision makers, policymakers, that palliative care is somehow this luxury. that somehow it's a nice to have. Oh, well, it'd be really great if we had a hospice, but there's a palliative care bed at the hospital, and that's good enough. As if somehow ensuring that we are providing the care to ensure that someone with a life-limiting illness and their loved ones and their caregivers around them are getting the right support that they need during one of the most challenging times in their lives. As if using the resources that already exist in a lot of cases, minimizing unnecessary interventions. We don't need to do the blood test to test their cholesterol. It doesn't matter. And why do we want to poke them another time to disturb them, right? It's actually a more efficient use of resources, and it's what patients and families want. And it provides a better quality of life and a better quality of death. And in some cases, I'm going to get real close to the mic here. Palliative care, in a lot of cases, can actually extend the length of life because you're not dealing with all of this extra symptom burden that's making your life miserable. So you have energy to do the happy things, to create those memories with your loved one. And so, there's so many reasons why it's an amazing thing. And when families receive great palliative care, it eases their grief journey as well, because your loved one didn't die in pain. Your loved one had an amazing caring team to support them that also cared about you. You have access to grief and bereavement support if or when you need it through the hospice palliative care provider. That they had access to spiritual care, so that if they had those big existential questions that often come up at the end of life, they had access to that. And so I think that the misconception that this is a luxury somehow, when we have the capacity and the resources, I wish we had more resources to provide this to everyone, but we have the skills and knowledge to do this if only we were to prioritize this. And I think that that's probably been the most frustrating piece, is when you see the stories, or when you hear the stories from families who say, I wish my loved one had gotten palliative care because this is what they went through at the end of life. And you see how painful and how frustrating and how distraught the families are left. This isn't a luxury. It's a fundamental human right. And that's probably been the most frustrating thing, because if everyone could agree that this is a fundamental human rights issue, because access to healthcare includes access to palliative care at the World Health Organization, the UN, they've affirmed that, then maybe we could get more political will and more will from the communities to really enforce this idea and and for folks to put their money where their mouth is at the policy level to make sure that this happens. So I think that that's probably been the most frustrating piece, is that perception that palliative care is somehow a nice to have.
And I feel it's often people who are making these policy decisions, or these decisions in general, often think, oh, it's not going to happen to me, it's going to happen to someone else. Or if it's going to happen to me, I'll be fine because I have X, Y, Z. And the reality is most people don't have the resources to self-advocate, or even to know what to advocate for. So you and I have spoken about this in other conversations. Just if people actually realized and recognized everyone and everything is going to die at some point, we will actually live a better life. And that includes having a better death. So
absolutely. We're seeing less death denying overall. It depends on the circles. So, some people agree or disagree, but what I'm seeing overall and what I'm hearing from folks in the grief space is a bit of, we're moving away from being death denying and moving more overall as a society to being death phobic or death illiterate. And so what we're hoping is really to see, as people stop denying that death is inevitable, that it's going to happen to every single one of us, that hopefully we can have meaningful conversations about, how well do you want to die? In my job, permutations of this question kind of live in my brain of, what is the marketing pitch for dying? Or more specifically, what is the marketing pitch for dying well? Because really that's what palliative care is all about. But really, more fundamentally, how we die is a part of how we live, just as much as how we are born is a part of how we live. And we need to really be able to, we talk about healthcare from cradle to grave. Are we really doing that for every single person in Canada? And we need to have these conversations, because witnessing someone in your life go through a painful or a less than ideal death, it's painful. It's horrendous. And there are ways to mitigate that. There are ways to make that, like, it's going to suck no matter what, right? Like, when someone dies, it's painful, it's awful. It's
Newsflash, dying sucks.
I mean, it's awful, right? But how bad do you want it to suck? Really, that's kind of it. And I'm putting this bluntly, but really that's what it comes down to. I saw there was a kind of an open letter in a newspaper somewhere in Ontario, and this is from a few months back, so I can't remember exactly, but talking about the care that his father, that this person's father had gotten at a hospice. It's going to be a painful experience. It's a part of life, but it can also be less painful. It doesn't have to be as painful if you have the right supports in place.
Yeah. And with your role at CHPCA, a lot of the work that you do revolves around public policy, public education, awareness, bring about the knowledge about the challenges and obstacles within the hospice and palliative care communities just across Canada, and also talking about your goals as an organization. Are you able to just speak to some of those projects and initiatives that you folks are currently undertaking? And if there's anything that you guys, or even personally, you want to see addressed in the next 5 or 10 years, if you're okay to share?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, directly in my role, just with communications, the awareness campaigns are a really big part of the work that I do. So National Hospice Palliative Care Week, also National Children's Hospice Palliative Care Day, because, life-limiting illnesses do not discriminate by age. Most of the people who need or benefit from palliative care are adults, and most of them are seniors. But that doesn't mean that these families that have a child with a life-limiting illness, with medical complexities, who are likely to be affected by, that it's likely to cause early death, or at least, move a lot of moving parts and a lot of complexity and a lot of medical care and intervention being required, they deserve as much support as anyone else going through this. And when it's a family, when it's a child that's affected, it really has an added layer of complexity, an added layer to it. And, these pediatric hospices and pediatric hospice palliative care programs do amazing work to not only, provide this palliative approach to care for these families and provide that support for those children, but also give these families a chance to be a family, the siblings to be siblings, the parents to be parents and not caregivers and care providers and health advocates, and the shuttle to and from the appointments. Give them the opportunity to spend time together, just an outing to the zoo. Things like that can make a world of difference for these families. So that's what we celebrate on National Children's Hospice Palliative Care Day, which is the second Thursday of every October. And also National Grief and Bereavement Day, the third Tuesday of November, to draw attention to to have a conversation around grief and bereavement in Canada, the supports that draw attention to the supports that are out there, but also really kind of honor the folks that we've lost, honor the folks that are grieving, and say, this is hard, but there are people here to help, and we see you, to recognize what they're going through in their journeys. We're also involved in we lead the Canadian Compassionate Companies certification for companies who have embedded in their HR policies compassionate workplace approaches, supports for caregivers who are employed working caregivers. They're basically juggling 2 full-time jobs, right? And so companies and organizations that have these practices in place to provide adequate supports for them, that provide resources on advanced care planning, provide life planning resources, like, hey, by the way, have you thought of it? Here's some information on how to do a will, because that's important. Here's some information about advanced care planning. If you can't advocate for yourself in a healthcare situation, here's, what do you want to happen? What's your priority? We also have the Advanced Care Planning in Canada project. There's an entire team dedicated to that. And most recently, we got funding to make the current project for the advanced care planning team is making advanced care planning resources more accessible for Canadians with disabilities, because they have just as much a right to be involved in decision making for their future healthcare. And so making sure that they have the information and the resources they need to be an active part of their healthcare decisions, even if they get to a place where they can't advocate for themselves anymore, or temporarily. So those are some of the things that we're leading. We have several others. There's no shortage of projects and things to do. We also do knowledge translation, or science communication, really about research in the palliative care space, to help kind of bring what the researchers are finding to, the general public, to the healthcare community, to the community organizations and frontline workers, so that they can be aware of, like, what is the research saying? What are the latest findings? How can we take this knowledge and bring it into practice? So we also support that. And
you're not busy. You're not busy.
No,
you have lots of free time.
Absolutely. So if people have new projects to throw our way, we're happy to take them on. But no, but also, it really, we're a small but mighty team, but we're not the only ones in this space, right? Like, we have so many partners. There's provincial hospice palliative care associations that do incredible work as well, and the local hospices. And really, all our work is really centered around trying to support ultimately what they're doing in their local community too.
We chat every few weeks, and I feel like every time we chat, it's always just like another event happening, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what again? It's powerhouse, man, powerhouse.
The palliative care space, it's actually quite a hop in place. It's filled with, and honestly, like, I'm so blessed to work in this area, really, because these people in this space are the kindest, warm-hearted doers of amazing things. And so I'm always, there's always a new cause or project or initiative that I'm like, have you heard about this? It's so exciting to be in this space, because really it's incredibly life affirming. Really, I can't say that enough.
You and I at dinner parties would be a blast. That's all I'm gonna say.
It's how I introduce myself when people ask me where I work. I'm like, I work at the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, which usually leads to this like uncomfortable half-second silence, which I inevitably follow up with, I'm a lot of fun at parties, I promise.
I always tell, when people ask, I always like, I make people very uncomfortable. And then there's like this pause of, do I ask? Is it what? So it's not wrong. I do often make people uncomfortable, or they're like so intrigued. When it comes to, I want to do bunny ears here, modern hospice palliative care, that most people are familiar with. It's been around for about 60 years, like since its inception. I would say that the actual act of providing care and support for those who are dying have actually been around for centuries before it was kind of coined, kind of like the beginning of our creation. Looking specifically at the last 60 years, how would you say societal attitudes towards palliative and hospice care have shifted since the, again, bunny ears, inception of this care?
It's been, I would say the last century has been a really interesting time in terms of societal attitudes around death and dying. I highly recommend Dr. Catherine Mannix's TED Talk. And now, just because I want to say the name of it, I can't think of it. But really, she is a big proponent of talking about ordinary dying. And she talks about how her grandmother knew how to knew death, because she had learned how to accompany in death from the women in her community who had been through it before. And they kind of shared, it was this community knowledge. And to be honest, it was usually women's work, because women did the caregiving, right? But then with modern medicine, kind of medicalized death. And death was no longer seen as this social event. And I say social, like it's, we're not talking about like a party, but also sometimes yes. But it was really seen as this community component of your community coming together to support that person and support the family. And then, when you started being able to send people to hospitals, and more often than not, they did survive, then all of a sudden dying people who, even if hospitals couldn't save them, would still be sent to the hospital because maybe, just maybe. And in that and then as medications and innovations and healthcare evolved, sending to the hospital was the logical thing to do because it could keep people alive. But that meant that there was less dying in the community. We lost that knowledge. What does death look like? Things like the quote unquote death rattle. What does it mean? No, your person isn't choking. They're okay. They just don't have that reflex to clear their throat. And so there's bubbles, but everything's going fine. But people don't know that. And it's incredibly distressing when you don't know what's going on. And so I would say that, and now with palliative care becoming more and more prevalent, more and more people having been through it and receiving it, there's, I think we're, as a society, more and more people are becoming more aware that we don't need to be medicalizing death as much as we are. We can reclaim it for ourselves. And palliative care can be a way to do that, to kind of walk that middle line between, yes, there is a medical component to it because, you want to manage symptoms, manage pain, manage all of those things, even though for most people, pain doesn't, for a quote unquote ordinary death, pain isn't necessarily the biggest concern. But, in certain circumstances, absolutely, you want to have pain control and pain management. Right. And so being able to walk that middle line between this is a human experience and we will bring human care to this and make sure that the medical needs are met. We're slowly moving back to that, I think, because people, having been through a medical death that seems so impersonal, there's that craving for that human touch, whether physical or just, that humanity to come through. We desperately need this. And so I think that they're slowly shifting. There is still a lot of misunderstanding around palliative care and what it does, but I think that more and more people, also with an aging population, we're seeing more dying. It's par for the course. And the more people go through the process and the more people accompany people through death, the more you go through it, the more you notice, did it really need to be like this? Or maybe someone did receive palliative care and then you're accompanying someone who didn't. And then you're going like, oh, this is very, very different. I don't like this. I much prefer this. And being able to see the difference, it's been a big shift. And with the way that our healthcare system is right now, really struggling to cope and, the health HR crisis, people don't want to be dying in hospitals because, hospitals are busy enough as it is. So, you're maybe not going to get the one-on-one care and attention that you might in a hospice or that you might with home care, with the on-call, palliative care nurse or so on. And so people want to reclaim that because they want the best for their loved ones. And palliative care really can provide that. It's person-centered care, ultimately. That's really what it's about. And it's not patient-centered care for a reason. It's person-centered because there's more to you than just being a patient.
And this conversation is reminding me of, I went to a talk a few weeks ago and it was talking about adjusting legislation to be more pretty much human-centric. And someone who was responsible for those changes was speaking with someone who was advocating for it. And their response was, you can't legislate love. And the person's response was, yeah, you can't legislate love, but you can legislate opportunities for where love can show up, like where that love and compassion can take place. And I think that's what people forget. I know when I heard it, I was like, oh my God, that makes sense. Like, that's what we need. My mind was like blown, and I've been thinking about it for the last few weeks and just reminding people that there is opportunity to provide love. It's just that we have to be allowed to have it grow and foster in those environments where it previously hasn't been able to or hasn't even been allowed to.
We have to consider those opportunities, right? When we talk about these systems, these systems are not, when we talk about systems, you think about structures and lines and flow charts and all of those things. And don't get me wrong, I love me a flow chart, but the systems exist for humans to work through. And sometimes we forget that humanity, that human component, that yes, we are talking about systems and there will be boxes and processes and forms. Yes. Okay. But we forget that these systems are there to guide people. And we need to think about the people in the system as much as we are thinking about the structures and the systems in place. And so I really love how that person framed that of opportunities for love, because that's really, sometimes you get lost in the nitty gritty, in the details, in the, the wording and the syntax. And you think about like, okay, well, if this comes through here, then we need somehow that piece of information to make it over there. But also we need to be thinking about what is the quote unquote, and I say this because it's kind of the technical word, but the user experience. The person who's using the system, who's being guided through the system, what is their experience like? And we are not logical beings. We like to think that we are.
As much as we want to say it, it's like, are we?
Oh my goodness, right? We think that we are intellectual, logical beings with the capacity for feeling. Really deep down, we are feeling beings with, on occasion, the capacity for logic, right? And so we need to take that into consideration, because feelings are not logical sometimes. And so we need to plan for that. We need to know that and accept that when we're talking about these big systems that every single person is going to go through, especially when we're talking about healthcare, especially when we're talking about end of life. These are particularly emotional times. So let's make sure that we're thinking about these things, because otherwise, what are we doing this for? This isn't an assembly line. This is a deeply universal experience that we will all face at some point, whether for ourselves or for someone else. And, these are world-shattering experiences. Your world changes when you lose a loved one. And so when we need to remember that and honor that when we're talking about how do we provide this care for our community members.
When we're looking at it from a systems perspective and the people that are in these systems, like looking at specifically like the healthcare world, I think we briefly spoke about it in this conversation or one of our previous conversations. When it comes to preparing healthcare workers to understand palliative care approaches, like how can we better prepare them to navigate those conversations? And part two is when it comes to grief and bereavement itself, like those emotions, how can we also elevate their education and their training so that it's provided to them, both for themselves and their patients?
Oh goodness, how long
do you have? It's a big question.
But, I think our medical education system, and this is for anyone in the healthcare field, whether it's, physicians in med school or nurses, social workers, all of the allied health professionals, occupational therapists, and so on. Death is a negative outcome, but death is the inevitable outcome. When we frame to them that death is bad, death means you failed, we are setting them up to fail, because their patients will die. They will. There's nothing we can do about that. And so when the goal is not death, then we are setting up death to be very scary, very bad, and to be avoided at all costs. So talking about death all of a sudden becomes very fraught, as opposed to framing it as the goal is life. The goal is quality of life. You want to keep people alive. Death, obviously, when it's avoidable, should be avoided if the goal is life. But framing death as this negative is setting them up for failure. Regardless of the specialty, regardless of the area of medicine or healthcare that they go into, these healthcare workers will be interacting with people with life-limiting illnesses. You can be a dermatologist, you will be interacting with people with life-limiting illnesses. And I say dermatology knowing that they work in this space, but the average person doesn't think of a dermatologist being like life or death stuff for the most part, And so you can be someone in a field that doesn't seem death adjacent. You will be caring for people with life-limiting illnesses. If you do not have the skills, the knowledge, or the understanding of a basic palliative approach to care, I'm not even talking specialist level stuff, just primary level care of, what are the things I need to be thinking about in terms of quality of life for this patient? am I taking into consideration the spiritual component, the personal component, the caregiver component, the grief component, right? If we're not giving these healthcare workers a basic understanding of just the palliative approach to care, then they're equipped to know when they're out of their depth. Then they know when they need specialist intervention of going like, this patient needs someone with a higher level of education on this than me. If we're not giving them the information to just recognize when someone might benefit from this, then they don't know when they don't know what they don't know. And so we really need to be, some medical schools are providing as little as 10 hours of class time on palliative care. The average hospice volunteer gets 20 to 30 hours of training before they can be a visiting hospice volunteer. We're giving more training on this to our volunteers than many medical students. That's atrocious. We are failing those medical students by not giving them the knowledge of how to care for patients with life-limiting illnesses. So we really need to be shifting how we're looking at what palliative care education is, because otherwise, how can we can't be surprised when then they don't know how to have that conversation with the family. They don't know how to bring up, have you thought about palliative care? I think palliative care would be helpful, because that perception of palliative care means giving up is still a thing. But really, palliative care is, I have hope that you can have better quality of life. And these are the people who can do that.
And there's also a lack of education from like the grief and bereavement side of things.
Oh, yes.
In terms of just talking about this, like even for the patients, so they also have a better understanding of how to navigate these conversations with them. And also the reality is you're dealing with people in a hospital caregiver setting. You will get attached. You will connect with these people that you're seeing likely like almost every day. And when they die or when their health takes a turn for the worst, you're going to be impacted. They're going to be impacted, and they're not given the support that they need to navigate that, on top of everything else that's going on in the world, right?
Absolutely.
So it's just,
you need to understand
unfortunate.
what you're experiencing. If they don't have the words to describe what it is, the moral injury that comes when you feel helpless, when you feel like there's nothing else you can do, the moral injury of, I wish I could have done this. I wish I had known that this person was dealing with XYZ, right? It's really a challenge for healthcare workers, especially when they're already under so much pressure right now.
Yeah.
We are asking a lot of our healthcare workers right now, and it behooves the system to give these people the information they need so they can cope with the inevitable feelings and emotions and experiences they're going to face, because they are on the front line of really some of the most challenging experiences that people go through, whether they're happening to someone that they care about or not, or like someone in their direct life that is kind of like in their circle. Just being there and being a witness to this family, to these people who are going through such a hard time.
You even mentioned your own grief journey in the beginning of the discussion, where you had experienced grief and death and loss early on in life, kind of had an understanding, and then you realized you didn't. Same thing for these folks, like they're in this area, and then we just want to avoid something from happening, where it's like, oh, we could have supported them during this time and we didn't. So when you were sharing about your grief journey, I also know you're a part of ADHD gang.
Neurospicy. Hooray.
Neurospicy. And you and I have spoken a little bit about this, how ADHD can actually affect grief and vice versa. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your thoughts and experiences on grief and ADHD?
Absolutely. And I think that it's funny, ADHD, because it's like your brain, it shapes your experience of the world, and it shapes how you process the world around you. And so the amount of times where I've gone like, wait, what? That's an ADHD thing? And it was kind of similar with grief, where I was like, wait, what? But I didn't realize that it could impact this. But, I talked about anticipatory grief, and I think a big part of that was also realizing why I rely on that so much is, now the literature calls it object permanence. And I have feelings about this because I'm not a toddler. I know that when I don't see something, it still exists.
So funny.
I
Oh my
wish they could
God.
come up with a better word for it, really. But, my brain is chaos already. So if I don't have reminders of the things, even things that I care deeply about, if I don't have like reminders in my physical space or in my life about certain things, it's not that it's not that it doesn't exist. I just forget that it exists. And then 6 months go by and I'm like, oh no, I forgot to text that person. So like I'm horrendous at keeping in touch with people. And for anyone that I know that might be listening to this, if I haven't reached out in a while, it's not that I don't like you. I just probably forgot and then didn't realize until 6 months later and then went, oh my God, I'm horrible. And now I feel awkward. And then I don't reach out because then I feel bad. And I'm like, how do I address this? I don't know how. And then it turns into 2 years. And then I'm like, oh,
I have no unique lived experiences. Like the more I learn about this, I'm like, I'm not unique. Anyways.
yeah. So like, I'm horrible at keeping in touch with family. I'm horrible at keeping in touch with friends. It's a thing. I'm working on it. I'm trying, but it also manifests with grief because, if I don't have an active reminder of someone in my life, I tend not to think about it. Not because I don't want to, not because they don't matter, but just there's so many other things, so many other thoughts in my brain happening that I do have reminders in my daily life and in my physical space for, that then it just kind of, and then 6 months later, it hits you. 8 months later, it hits you. You get that one tiny reminder, and then all of a sudden you are on that same day all over again. And then on top of that, you get to feel the guilt. How could I not think about this person for this long? Did I not care about them? I'm so horrible for not thinking about them for this long. I haven't checked in with their family. Oh my gosh. And you feel awful. And I would beat myself up for that so much until I finally came to grips, or kind of, I put the puzzle pieces together. Oh, this is the ADHD thing. And that's why. Okay. And once you know why, one, I can stop feeling like a garbage person for it, because I realize it's something that's beyond my control. But also understanding the why I'm coping or why this is happening helps me to mitigate it, helps me to go like, okay, what I know this is likely, if left to my own devices, this is what happens, whether I want it to or not, right? So how can I come up with a system to make that different? It's also why I rely so heavily on anticipatory grief, because, and this is something that kind of just happened organically because of just how I function as a person, but while the person is still alive, I have more reminders of them in my daily life. So when I see them, when I think about them, there's more opportunities to do that. And there's more like just inherent reminders because they're still alive. And so I do a lot of my processing that way, which is why when Zach died, it hit me like a ton of bricks because I didn't have the opportunity to do that. And because we were the kind of friends that we could go 8 months without talking, the number of reminders that I had in my life were not, overflowing. And so it made it really hard for me to process that loss because all of a sudden, one thing, I had to get rid of Snapchat because I'm an introvert and I have ADHD. So, and I'm horrible at staying in touch with people. So like I have a small circle of really good friends. And so, and he and I would go back and forth on Snapchat with cat pictures of our respective cats. And between him dying and me finding out about his death, I had sent him a ton of cat pictures. And seeing those unopened cat pictures was just like, it just destroyed me every time I opened Snapchat. So I had to get rid of it because it was just too much. And because I was like, I need to make at least like 5 other friends just on Snapchat so that I like, at least it's lower on the list. But also like it just, I really struggled to cope because then, your friend sends you this funny picture on Snapchat and then you try and process that, but then you're thinking about your grief while trying to send funny cat pictures or do weird faces at one another. Right. So, ADHD really changed how I thought about grief because as I was learning more about ADHD, as I was learning more about my brain and how it works. And so I had to start thinking about like, okay, I need to schedule time to grieve, which sounds ridiculous, but I had to schedule some time of like, okay, at this time, or something that felt kind of organic, or some kind of place where I knew I had the space and time that a reminder of the person would feel normal for me. And just schedule that time to remind myself and put a little physical reminder in my space so that I didn't go X amount of time without thinking about it. And then I get one random reminder out in the wild and I'm brought to my knees, right? So I had to kind of do those little things. And I had to, for Zach, like, I'm really grateful for my therapist for, at the time, for like helping me kind of think about that of like, oh, wait a minute, and identifying that that was the gap, that I hadn't gotten that pre-grieving, so to speak, done. And I had to kind of do some pre-grieving, post-grieving work to do those goodbyes and do that processing that I would have normally done before they died, to do it afterwards, so that then I could redo my normal grieving rituals and it would actually feel more not complete, not not resolved, but at least feel not feel like it was undone.
I know you shared with me some YouTube videos about the overlap with ADHD and grief. We'll include it in the show notes, because I was watching some of them and I was like, this is what? Like, how even? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And again, I have no unique lived experience. We're just all the same.
When you don't know a ton of other neurospicy people, as I like to say, you feel like the odd one out so much. And then you meet other people who have similar brains to you. And then you go, oh, okay, I'm not like the unique, strange solo person in the world. There's other people like me. Oh, okay. It feels less alone, but then also sometimes you're like, like, do I have anything unique about me? And sometimes it's the fact that like the unique mishmash of those experiences make you just you. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, because I think that it's, so often the ADHD symptoms and diagnosis criteria are so external facing, right? It's what's disruptive in the classroom. It's what's disruptive in the workplace. We don't talk enough about the things about ADHD that are really internal, that are disruptive in your personal life that other people don't see. Because, and I could go on about all of those things, but I think we, as a society, we need to do a better job of recognizing the invisible parts of these diagnoses, of these experiences, because when something affects your brain, it affects your experience of the world. And that means that everything about all of it is maybe not wildly different, but slightly different. And that can be really isolating. And grief on its own can already be so isolating when you feel like no one could possibly understand, because our communities don't talk about this stuff. And then on top of that, having that unique experience of it as someone with ADHD, with autism, some kind of neurodivergence, then it's this added layer of isolation and loneliness, which is the connection is so important in grief. It's so vital. And so thanks for giving me the opportunity to kind of share and say, like, if this resonates with you at all, I hope that it helps you feel less alone, for anyone who's listening, because there are people out there who understand. And it's important for you to know that, like, whatever your experience is, there's someone out there. Maybe they don't fully get it, but they can at least listen and they can at least relate in some way.
Thank you for sharing and helping to normalize the conversation about it. So this one and death related, just everything. Just thank you. As we're coming to a close, what is one thing you want to tell people who may be unfamiliar, or who are unfamiliar with hospice and palliative care and the type of work that you do? If you had to pick one thing.
It's about living. And Now, I'm going to want to read a quote from Dame Cicely Saunders. She's the founder of the modern hospice movement. She was from the UK. And, folks in the palliative care space know this quote very well. It's repeated ad nauseum, but I will never not love it, because really, when I was starting to learn more about palliative care, starting in this new job and going like, oh gosh, how do I talk about this? And what is this? Oh my gosh, there are so many things to learn. But when I read this quote, it just kind of clicked with me, like on a deeper level of what this was about. What she said was, you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can to help you, not only to die peacefully, but to live until you die. And that really is the essence of what this is about. It's not about dying. I mean, it is, don't get me wrong. Like, we're not going to pretend like that isn't a part of it, but the core of it is living. And when you look at it through that lens, it's living well in the ways that matter most to you and your family. And palliative care is a gift. It is the gift of peace of mind. It is the gift of living on your own terms and knowing what matters to you and maybe what doesn't. It's a gift. And the earlier you can get it, the more they can do. So if you have a loved one with a life-limiting illness, if you have one yourself, ask about palliative care way before you think you might need it, because you would be amazed at the amount of beauty and peace and joy and opportunities for love that it can bring. And so if there's one thing I can say is, talk to your healthcare providers about it, ask about it, talk to the local hospice, talk to whoever might be able to give you information, and maybe just recognize, maybe not right now, but this is where, if we get to that point, or if we get to XYZ, then I know who to call. It's about saying, this is hard, you're dealing with a lot, and here are people who can help you deal with it.
That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Fantastic. My last question that people love to hate to love. How do you want to be remembered?
It's funny. I went into nonprofit work on purpose, fully knowing that it would be about, that there are issues in nonprofit work, the pay isn't competitive, the benefits aren't competitive, so on and so forth. And there's, you're kind of at the mercy of funding and so on and so forth. And I mean, I did that in part because I come from a long line of quote unquote public servants in various forms. My maternal grandparents have been consummate volunteers, and like the amount of things that they're involved with, honestly, like they're in their, up until very, very recently, when they were like, okay, like we need to take a step back, but like in their 70s, they like volunteered more than most people work in a week. Involved in their Golden Age Club in their community, involved in their church, involved in the Knights of Columbus, and all of the painting group, and this, that, and the other thing. My grandmother on my father's side, she was one of the co-founders of what was at the time the Ontario Lupus Association, what is now Lupus Ontario. My mom was a teacher. My dad is a public servant. So really, if I went into anything that wasn't community serving, I felt like I was failing my ancestors, so to speak. So I think that would be the big thing for me, is I want to be remembered as someone who wanted to help. I wanted to make a difference and build community. I come from an arts background. I did my undergrad in painting. But during an internship at the local community center, the MIFO here in Orleans, a French community center in east end of the city, it was an arts management kind of internship, but I fell in love with the community building. And that's kind of what led me to nonprofit work. And so I want to be remembered as someone who cared. I want to be remembered as someone who wanted to help, who was a voice for doing better for one another in our communities. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. That, and I mean, I don't know if it's how I want to be remembered, but inevitably I will be remembered as someone who just could talk for hours endlessly.
And we love you for it.
Oh gosh, I have so many soapboxes that I step up onto. Honestly, I should live in a soap factory for the amount of soapboxes that I have about various issues. But yeah, I think that that's how I would want to be remembered, someone who wanted to help. And I hope that I do that. I hope that I can, and I hope that I achieve that. Yeah, I just want to be remembered as someone who cared and who wanted to help.
You will definitely be remembered for that. You've helped so many people. I know you're so helpful to me all the time. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. That. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I mean, if I could do some shameless plugs for CHPCA, I will kind of go on that. But if folks want to find local resources, local providers of palliative care, chpca.ca. We have a directory of services you can look up by your city and see what's available in your area if you or a loved one are in need of support, whether it's grief and bereavement, support for caregivers, support to receive palliative care. So we have that. If folks are in organizations that have great HR policies to accommodate and to support caregivers in the workplace, please consider becoming a Canadian compassionate company to kind of demonstrate your leadership on those issues. You can subscribe to our newsletter on our website to stay up to date of what CHPCA is doing, what's happening across Canada in palliative care. And we have a new blog for folks who are professionals in this space or volunteers in this space. If you go to chpca.ca/blog, it's called The Palliative Approach. And if folks want to share and post articles, I know we have one from you, Maria, from throwback from a couple of years ago that we love on there. And follow us on social media. We're on all of the platforms. No, actually, that is a lie. We are not on TikTok. But
yet, maybe.
Listen.
There's a lot of work to do. It's a lot.
There's a lot there. But yeah, so we're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, whatever people are calling it now. And so if people want to stay up to date about this, then absolutely join us and stay up to date. We'd love to have you among our little crew of palliative care champions. And we have a new report that we just published about the number of hospice beds in hospice residences in Canada. If folks are curious about what that landscape looks like right now, we have a new report on the CHPCA website as well.
You nailed that. That was perfect.
Thank you. It's almost like I do this for a living.
Yeah, it's like, what? Who are you? Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate you, and I will chat with you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. And I also really appreciate you too, Maria. So thank you. And thank you to your listeners for being curious and wanting to learn more about this and learning more about life, really, because that's what it's about.
I hope you enjoyed this heartfelt conversation with Katrielle. She's incredibly insightful and inspiring, and I love getting the chance to chat with her. Friends, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a 5-star review. You can find us online at Philotimoleif, that's PHILOTIMOLIFE. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there's some exciting news on the way. But you'll have to wait until the next episode to find out what that is. Thanks for listening.